Imagine that there had never been a James Bond film before.
Vodka martini. Shaken or stirred?
Do I look like I give a damn?
We really had to bring it back to basics. We really had to start over again.
Your file shows no kills. It takes 2.
They wanted to go back to Bond's roots, how they wanted to find a pure expression of who James Bond was.
A high-stakes poker game at Casino Royale in Montenegro. 10 players, $10 million buy-in.
Barbara and Michael said they wanted to go back to the book. You know, that I immediately read the book, and that was interesting.
First Fleming novel, and tells the story of Bond's first mission as a 007.
Casino Royale is the sort of holy grail. It's a very brutal book.
Of all the novels, it seemed the darkest.
The security we had was going back to Ian Fleming, going back to the roots.
The literary character and the film character are different.
Ian Fleming created one of the most interesting, complex characters of the 20th century.
Bond, certainly in that novel, is a rather dark character.
He's not the same James Bond that we're kind of used to.
There's no one quite like him.
He's a soldier, he's a priest, he's a warrior.
He is an unstoppable force.
Bond has a 007, has a license to kill. He has to use his own judgment.
He's incorruptible.
He's a bit of a bastard, but boy, he's a debonair one.
Can I get a bottle of chilled Bollinger Condamné and the beluga caviar?
With everything?
Yes, with everything.
And would that be for 2, sir?
What?
For 2?
No, for 1.
Actually, Bond was Ian. It was a surrogate version of himself, which he very cleverly invented and put himself into his books.
There's a lot of Ian there, but not all Ian as it actually turned out.
This was his fantasy figure. It was based on aspects of his own character that he would have liked to have accentuated.
Bond looks in a mirror and sees himself, and the description is a description of Ian. This face that looked like Hoagie Carmichael with a comma of black hair falling over his forehead. Most of the thing that makes the books work is that they are highly personal essays in autobiography, really. All of Ian's prejudices, hopes, dreams.
There's a definite autobiographical, but it's not all based on fact. Some of it on, I won't say fantasy, but maybe wishes.
Ian Fleming was a rich kid, quite well educated, who had a very domineering mother who pushed him into various possible career paths.
The family all called her M, and it's no coincidence, I think, that James Bond's boss is called M. He had an extremely heroic father who died a hero's death. He had to live up to him.
He eventually ended up a journalist, which he was moderately successful at. He spent time in the city because that was the métier of his family, the banking Flemings. But he found himself as the personal assistant to the Director of Naval Intelligence during the Second World War.
Ian Fleming did, during the wars, very good work, intelligence work.
He was able to act as the eyes and ears of his boss, Admiral Godfrey, the Director of Naval Intelligence, and he proved a very skillful operator in his job. He began thinking, even during the war, of the perfect spy book that he was going to write.
For the origins of Casino Royale go back to 1941. Ian Fleming and his boss, Admiral Godfrey, traveled to Portugal. They were on a mission that would eventually take them to the United States. But while in Portugal, Fleming sat down and gambled at a casino, the Estoril Casino.
Well, they went into the casino, and there were some Germans there who might have been German agents. And in Ian's fervid imagination, German agents they became.
Ian went in there and he thought, wouldn't it be great if I were to take them on and actually to clean them out?
And so they tried to play and beat these Germans. In fact, the Germans won. So I mean, a typical Ian thing, that things didn't work out. But he based his, in Casino Royale, he makes it work.
After this trip to Portugal, Ian Fleming and Admiral Godfrey traveled to New York, and there they met at Rockefeller Center with Sir William Stevenson, who was head of the British Security Coordination. At this point, the United States is not in the war. It's 1941, but before Pearl Harbor. And while in New York, Fleming gets to watch Stevenson's men break into a safe inside the Japanese consulate in Rockefeller Center. Fleming later fictionalizes this incident for the novel Casino Royale, and he makes it where it's one of James Bond's first assassinations. From New York, Fleming travels down to Washington, D.C. While in Washington, Ian Fleming has a small but lasting impact on the history of espionage in America.
So in June 1941, you have Ian Fleming sitting down with William J. Donovan, who would become the head of the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, and hashing out the political parameters and realities of coming up with an intelligence service here in the States. The memo that Fleming drafted actually set the stage for America's involvement in a formalized intelligence arena. Donovan so respected what Ian Fleming had incorporated into this draft memorandum that they ended up sending to FDR that he presented Fleming with a special keepsake pistol, and he had engraved on it, "For special services."
The war for Ian was wonderful. He's been in on so many things. He sent other people off to their death, which was something I think that troubled him too.
Ian managed to establish something called the 30 Assault Unit, or 30 AU, and the idea of what these men did was to be trained intelligence gathering officers who happened to be commando trades, special ops. They would go in with the frontline troops, and before the boys started planning the detonation devices, Ian's boys would go in and start ransacking the place looking for things that had anything in the way of an intelligence value attached to it, a map, codes, keys to codes, all sorts of things like that. It was a bonanza. It really proved itself, this 30 AU, in Sicily, and then again in Italy. And then come time for making plans for D-Day, they actually factored the 30 AU into D-Day operational planning. I think it started out with something like 40 or 60 men and grew to 450. That's how good it was. But Ian was one of these individuals that saw the strategic importance of intelligence.
With the end of the war, he found himself very much out on a limb.
It seems that he might have been a bit disappointed that he wasn't kept on to be a member of the Secret Service, to be a member of MI6. He found himself foreign manager of the Sunday Times.
And got himself a job on the Sunday Times, which is where I knew him.
He negotiated a wonderful contract which gave him 3 months to spend time at the new house that he was building in Jamaica. Now this was GoldenEye. He was able in his late 30s to sort of carry on his really pre-war bachelor life.
I ran into Mr. Fleming in Jamaica, and a great friend of mine was mad about Ian, and I thought he was treating her terribly. I said, "Mr. Fleming, I consider you a cad." And he said, "You're entirely correct, Mrs. Leiter, shall we have a drink on it?" And we never looked back. He was absolutely charming.
Ian Fleming had had a long and somewhat controversial relationship with Lady Anne Rothermere. He had known her when she was single. He had known her when she was married to Lord O'Neill, who died during World War II. The relationship had continued after she got married to Lord Rothermere, the famous press baron. She became pregnant with Ian's child in 1951, and Lord Rothermere filed for divorce. Ian and Anne went to Jamaica, to his house, GoldenEye there. And as Ian awaited the divorce decree in January, February, and March of 1952, he sat at his desk every morning and wrote a novel, Casino Royale.
Why did he write it? Who knows? He said that he did it in order to get over the fact that he was about to get married and to take his mind off such things.
I think there's no question that Ian started writing these books to offset a very serious midlife crisis. And I think the idea of getting married and being suddenly tied to one woman after this life of womanizing that he'd had, that also was a shock, and all sorts of things were.
It's difficult to know because Ian often said things with a tongue in his cheek.
What we do know is that Ian Fleming had the core ideas for Casino Royale from the early years of World War II. He told his colleagues during the war that afterwards he was going to write the spy novel, Tyndall spy novels. Now, why didn't he write the novel in 1946 or 47? I think the reason for that is that the events had taken place in World War II. Fleming was someone who lived in the present, not the past. Well, by 1951, we were at the heat of a new war, the Cold War, a war that would become the perfect setting for the introduction of James Bond.
There was a great deal of apprehension, certainly in government circles, about the status of the Cold War at that time.
Soviets had been successful in stealing American atomic secrets, allowing them to build an atomic bomb years before intelligence had predicted that they would have it.
the Allies, and especially the United States, had disarmed themselves. They literally blew up planes on the tarmacs. They scuttled ships. They had downsized the army from over 12 million men in uniform to just a few 100,000 men in uniform. George Marshall predicted that if the Soviets set out and to launch an offensive from Eastern Europe, that they could arrive in Paris within weeks and that there would be nothing to stop them.
It just didn't look as if things were going terribly well for either the United States or Britain.
For those of us who grew up in the Cold War, the threat of a nuclear holocaust was ever present. Reading a James Bond book reminds you of the tension of international politics at that time and the feeling that we were in an undeclared war with the Soviet Union.
The theme of Casino Royale is treachery. What drives people to treachery? What are the consequences of it? There was a cataclysmic event in the lives of people like Ian Fleming in May 1951 when two top British diplomats, Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean, defected to the Soviet Union.
There was a group of students at Cambridge University in the 1930s who, most of whom were recruited by the Soviets while they were students or shortly thereafter to work for Soviet intelligence. The first two to have defected to Moscow, most famously, were Donald Maclean and Guy Burgess, who had been at Cambridge at the same time. There was a great deal of resistance in British circles, certainly intelligence, Foreign Office, elsewhere, to the whole notion that some of theirs were spies. And I think that part of what was so difficult for the British to accept, as one security official told me years later, he said, you know, my file on people was what we called the A and D file, the adultery and drink file, because those were the worst transgressions that we could imagine anybody from the upper classes committing. And the idea that you could have people who were born of title, of wealth, of privilege, that would then betray their country and betray their colleagues was simply not comprehended by the British.
Ian Fleming zeroes in the novel anyway, on the sort of personal circumstances which led Vesper to betray her country. The Bond books were a sort of almost a willful British effort to build up the image of the British intelligence service, which had been seriously damaged by the defections of Burgess Maclean.
You could say that James Bond represented the old school, or at least the best of the old school. And of course, that's what Ian Fleming represented himself.
We felt powerless in the Cold War, and the James Bond stories were a fantasy in which there was a very smart and courageous and resourceful man, a very tough man, who was kind of on the inside and was saving us from something that we couldn't save ourselves from.
They were stories about good versus evil, the West versus the Soviet bloc.
There are many parallels between what's happening now and what happened in the 50s when Fleming was writing this. Certainly we've become a nation or nations of fear again. And that was very much the case in the early 50s. We knew there were the bad guys were out there. I guess it was the Soviet Union, it was communism. We just couldn't really see them or feel them. We just knew they were over there and they were going to do something, and they were surrounding us, and there were betrayals popping up here and there. It was a really unsettling time for everyone, and it's a really unsettling time now.
It was probably Ian Fleming's good fortune, commercially speaking, that there was substantial doubt in the West at the time as to whether the West was winning the Cold War. In a time of doubt and uncertainty, he injected this character who was anything but doubt and uncertainty. Why has James Bond as a character survived all these decades? It is amazing. I mean, this is what's half a century. It's remarkable. I think it has to do with the enduring fascination with that kind of character, someone who can get his hands dirty yet somehow keep his soul clean. We want to believe that people like that are really out there.
Ian Fleming represents a real quantum jump in espionage literature. He took the popularity of this kind of story to a new high once Bond had taken off and become really the market leader, I suppose, in popular fiction, not just espionage fiction. Everybody wanted to create their own James Bond. And if you remember in the 60s, one after another, people were creating these tough, smart, well-dressed secret agents who got into fights and had a lot of sex and drove terrific cars. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery.
John le Carré is not a great fan of Ian Fleming and tends to deride him.
John le Carré, of course, was in MI6 before he resigned to write his books. Le Carré represents a reaction to James Bond in the context of, if you really think it's all shaken martinis, forget it. Let me tell you exactly what it's like. And these two views play off each other. They're very helpful for one another.
You know, I'm a huge le Carré fan. And I think certainly that this Bond is influenced by him. Le Carré's world is very complex. And Bond wants his world to be very simple. And somewhere in the middle these two meet. But I don't think you ever can take away Bond's confidence. You can shake him, and you can shake him to his core. You can shake him right down to his bones. But you know he will recover. You know he'll pull himself out, and he'll do what he believes to be the right thing, even if it's the wrong thing in the moment. He will act. And well, le Carré's characters may have been paralyzed and been ruined because of it. This man will always come through for us.
James, get the girl out.
The issue of getting Bond to see the big picture, I think, pops up a couple of times in the film.
You're supposed to display some kind of judgment.
I did. I thought that one less bomb maker in the world would be a good thing.
Exactly. One bomb maker. We're trying to find out how an entire network of terrorist groups is financed, and you give us one bomb maker. Hardly the big picture, wouldn't you say?
When he's being tortured.
Because if you kill me, there'll be nowhere else to hide. But you are so wrong!
Because even after I slaughtered you and your little girlfriend, your people would still welcome me with open arms. Because they need what I know. The big picture.
I very much like the character of Le Chiffre. The fact that he was a smaller character in a larger machine really did come from the book.
Tell them I'll get the money.
Money isn't as valuable to our organization as knowing who to trust.
When Dick Maybaum and I were working on the scripts, that Cubby would often say, well, you know, you always go back to Fleming. And I think it's good advice. It's advice that we give to the writers from time to time, because it takes you back to the character, it takes you back to the situations that are what we might call Bondian situations. I guess there's some people that heard we were going to do Casino Royale and thought we would not do it well because we would shy away from the difficult things.
And the important thing for us was, if you're going to do it, you had to do it close to the novel.
The two things we said that we absolutely had to keep from the book, no matter what, was the torture scene, which is in many ways Bond's chrysalis, the moment that he understands that what he is doing is about life and death, that he actually may die, and he's put to the ultimate test. And the other thing was the final line in the book.
The bitch is dead.
It defines him in terms of his emotions and his emotional life, that he basically closes the door on his emotional life. He understands at the end of Casino Royale that he can never have the kind of normal romantic life, emotional life, that most people are able to have because of his job.
The idea is that he has now got his quest.
Hello?
Mr. White, we need to talk.
It is to go after the hand that holds the whip and the force that makes people spy.
Who is this?
He wants to go up the ladder of command and get to the hand that holds the gun and the whip.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
You had the betrayals of the Cambridge spies in 51, and that shook people, just because these were people who looked like us, who were villains. That's really unsettling. Much easier to carve out, people with black hats, people with white hats. But how untrue it is. And I think that was the world that Fleming was dealing with. There was a need for simplicity, and yet, so he wrote a simple character, but a very complex one at the same time. And that's the beauty of Bond.
The concept of a hero going out on a quest to defeat evil and resolving that story for good or for bad, that is a universal human experience. And that is one that I think Ian Fleming tapped into and exercised as well as any writer in the 20th century.
When I started to write fiction, what I wanted to do, my aim was to give my readers the kind of pleasure that I had got from Ian Fleming's books, because that was the greatest pleasure I'd ever had in literature, was the James Bond stories. They were just 10 times as good as anything else that I'd ever read.
I still read Fleming all the time, and as many times as I've read the books, every time I read them, I find them so entertaining and so witty and clever and exciting.